King Alexander stood in the grand hallway of Windermere Palace, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, as he gazed up at the portrait gallery that had adorned these walls for decades. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. At 72, the king had seen many changes in his 40-year reign, but none quite as significant as the decision he was about to make. The portrait that dominated the center wall showed Lady Victoria Ashworth, his second wife, adorned in the royal blue velvet gown she had worn to their coronation 15 years ago. Her piercing green eyes seemed to follow him as he moved, and her carefully composed smile spoke of the political marriage that had brought their two kingdoms together. Below her portrait hung smaller frames containing images from their wedding day, state visits, and various royal ceremonies. But it was the newer addition to the gallery that drew his attention most powerfully. Princess Catherine of Millbrook's portrait had been installed just 6 months ago, following her marriage to his eldest son, Prince Edward. Unlike Victoria's formal, calculated pose, Catherine's image captured something entirely different. Her warm brown eyes held genuine kindness, and her smile seemed to light up the entire canvas. She wore a simple cream-colored dress with minimal jewelry, yet she radiated a natural elegance that no amount of royal training could manufacture. The king's personal secretary, James Morrison, approached quietly from behind. "Your Majesty, the royal council is assembled and waiting for your decision." Alexander nodded slowly, still studying the portraits. The choice before him was unprecedented in the kingdom's history. Never before had a reigning monarch been forced to choose between supporting his wife or his daughter-in-law in such a public and dramatic fashion. The scandal that had erupted 3 weeks ago had shaken the very foundations of the royal family and threatened to tear apart the carefully maintained unity they had presented to the world. The trouble had begun during the annual Harvest Festival, the kingdom's most beloved tradition where royal family members visited different provinces to celebrate with the people. Lady Victoria had insisted on maintaining the formal protocols that had been established during her reign, requiring elaborate ceremonies, extensive security details, and carefully scripted interactions with citizens. She believed these traditions maintained the dignity and mystique of the crown. Princess Catherine, however, had taken a remarkably different approach. Instead of following the established protocol, she had spontaneously left her security detail to help an elderly farmer whose cart had overturned on the main road. The images of the future queen, still in her formal gown but with dirt on her hands as she helped gather scattered apples, had spread across the kingdom within hours. The people's response was immediate and overwhelming. They saw in Catherine someone who truly understood their struggles and cared about their welfare. The contrast became even more stark when video emerged of Lady Victoria's visit to the same province later that day. While Catherine had been helping the farmer, Victoria had been demanding that her limousine be rerouted to avoid the unsightly aftermath of the cart incident. When local officials explained that the detour would mean disappointed children wouldn't see the royal procession, Victoria had dismissed their concerns with a wave of her hand, stating that keeping to schedule was more important than accommodating every minor inconvenience. The kingdom's media, usually respectful of royal privacy, found themselves covering a story that wrote itself. Social media exploded with comparisons between the two women. Hashtags like Princess of the People and Real Royalty began trending, almost exclusively featuring images and videos of Catherine. Meanwhile, criticism of Victoria's perceived coldness and detachment from common concerns grew louder each day. King Alexander had hoped the controversy would fade with time, as royal scandals typically did. However, the situation had only intensified when Catherine announced her intention to establish a new charitable foundation focused on supporting working families in rural communities. Her proposal included using portions of the royal estate's unused land to create affordable housing and job training centers. The initiative was exactly the kind of forward-thinking, socially conscious project that resonated with younger generations and progressive political leaders. Victoria had immediately opposed the plan, arguing that it would set dangerous precedents about royal involvement in social engineering. She had used her influence with several conservative council members to block funding for the initiative, claiming that the royal family should maintain traditional boundaries between monarchy and social policy. Her opposition wasn't just philosophical, it was deeply personal. Victoria saw Catherine's growing popularity as a direct threat to her own position and legacy. The final breaking point had come during a private family dinner just 1 week ago. Prince Edward had announced that he and Catherine were expecting their first child, news that should have brought joy and unity to the family. Instead, Victoria had responded with barely concealed hostility, questioning whether Catherine was ready for the additional responsibilities of motherhood while pursuing her misguided charitable ambitions. Catherine, who had endured months of subtle criticism and passive-aggressive comments from her stepmother-in-law, had finally reached her limit. In front of the entire family, she had calmly but firmly stated that she would not raise her children in an environment where kindness and compassion were seen as political liabilities. She had looked directly at Victoria and said, "I will not teach my children that being royal means being disconnected from the people we serve." The room had fallen silent as the implications of Catherine's words settled over everyone present. Prince Edward had immediately supported his wife, stating that their children would be raised with values that honored both royal tradition and genuine service to others. Even Princess Margaret, the king's youngest daughter, had nodded in agreement with Catherine's position. Victoria had left the dinner in a fury, and since that evening the palace had been quietly but intensely divided. Staff members found themselves choosing sides, with the older, more traditional employees supporting Victoria's emphasis on protocol and dignity, while younger staff members gravitated toward Catherine's approachable, service-oriented philosophy. Now, as King Alexander stood before the portrait gallery, he understood that his decision would determine not just the immediate future of his family, but the long-term direction of the monarchy itself. The choice was about more than personal preferences or family dynamics. It was about what kind of royal family the kingdom would have for the next generation. James Morrison cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, if I may." The public opinion polls conducted this morning show Princess Catherine with an approval rating of 87%, while Lady Victoria's rating has dropped to 31%. The Prime Minister has also requested a private audience to discuss what he calls the sustainability of current royal arrangements. Alexander turned to face his secretary, a man who had served the crown faithfully for over 20 years. "James, in your opinion, what would my father have done in this situation?" The older man considered the question carefully. "Your Majesty, your father always believed that the crown's greatest strength came from the love and respect of the people. He used to say that royal blood without popular support was just expensive decoration." The king smiled at the memory of his father's practical wisdom. King Henry had ruled during a time of significant social change, successfully modernizing many royal traditions while maintaining the essential dignity and purpose of the monarchy. He had often spoken about the need for each generation of royals to earn their place through service, rather than simply inherit it through birthright. Walking slowly along the portrait gallery, Alexander studied the faces of his ancestors. Each had faced their own challenges and had been forced to make difficult choices about the future of the kingdom. Some had chosen tradition over progress, and had seen their influence diminish. Others had embraced change and had strengthened the monarchy's connection to the people. He paused before a portrait of Queen Isabella, his great-grandmother, who had ruled during the kingdom's Industrial Revolution. She had faced similar criticism for supporting social reforms that conservative nobles had opposed. Her decision to back workers' rights and educational improvements had been controversial at the time, but history had vindicated her choices. The social stability and economic prosperity that followed had strengthened the kingdom for generations. The sound of approaching footsteps caused Alexander to turn. Prince Edward was walking toward him, his expression serious but determined. At 35, the Crown Prince had grown into a thoughtful, capable leader who had earned respect both within the palace and among international diplomatic circles. His marriage to Catherine had been a love match, unusual for royal unions, but it had proven to be a source of strength for both of them. "Father," Edward said, stopping a respectful distance away, "I wanted to speak with you before the council meeting." "Of course, my son. I imagine you have strong feelings about the situation we find ourselves in." Edward nodded, glancing up at Catherine's portrait. "I do, but I want you to know that I understand the difficulty of your position. Whatever you decide, I will support publicly. However, I also want you to understand that Catherine and I are prepared to step back from royal duties if necessary. We will not compromise our values or our children's future for the sake of appearances." The king studied his son's face, seeing both determination and sadness there. Edward had always been dutiful, never causing scandals or shirking responsibilities. His willingness to potentially give up his inheritance spoke to the depth of his convictions and his love for his wife. Edward, what do you see when you look at Catherine's work with the people? I see the future, Father. I see a monarchy that serves rather than simply exists. Catherine doesn't diminish our traditions. She gives them meaning. When she helps that farmer or visits families in struggling communities, she's showing the kingdom what royal service actually looks like in the modern world. Alexander walked over to the large window that overlooked the palace gardens. In the distance, he could see groups of citizens gathered at the palace gates, many holding signs supporting Catherine and calling for changes in royal priorities. The protests had been peaceful but persistent, growing larger each day as more people learned about the internal conflict within the royal family. "And what about Victoria?" the king asked. "She has served the crown faithfully for 15 years. She brought political stability through our marriage alliance, and she has maintained the dignity of royal ceremonies and traditions." Edward joined his father at the window. "Victoria has served according to her understanding of what the monarchy should be. I respect that, even if I disagree with it. But Father, look at those people outside. They're not protesting against the crown itself. They're asking for a crown that represents their values and hopes for the future." The king was quiet for several minutes, watching the peaceful crowd outside. These were his people, citizens who still believed in the monarchy enough to gather and make their voices heard. Their presence was not threatening but hopeful, a sign that they wanted the royal family to succeed and remain relevant in their lives. "James," Alexander called to his secretary, "please ask Captain Williams to bring me the box from my private study, the one marked with my father's seal." As James hurried away, Edward looked curious. "Father, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about a conversation I had with your grandfather when I was about your age. He told me that every king faces moments when he must choose between what is easy and what is right, between what preserves the past and what secures the future." Captain Williams, the head of the king's personal guard, arrived carrying an ornate wooden box that had clearly been crafted generations ago. Alexander took it carefully, running his fingers over the intricate carvings on the lid before opening it. Inside, wrapped in faded blue silk, was a letter written in his father's distinctive handwriting. The king unfolded the letter and read silently for a moment before looking up at his son. "Your grandfather wrote this for me to read when I faced my most difficult decision as king." He wrote, "The crown does not make the person worthy. The person must make the crown worthy. Choose always to support those who serve with genuine hearts over those who serve with convenient loyalties." Edward felt a surge of emotion as he understood the significance of his father's words. "Father, are you saying—" "I'm saying that tomorrow morning I will be asking the palace staff to remove Victoria's portraits from the main gallery and replace them with additional portraits of Catherine. I will also be announcing my full support for her charitable foundation and her vision for a more engaged, service-oriented monarchy." The decision, once spoken aloud, felt both momentous and inevitable. Alexander had known, perhaps from the beginning, that this choice would have to be made. The kingdom's future lay not with those who clung to outdated notions of royal superiority, but with those who understood that true nobility came from service to others.
"What about Victoria?" Edward asked gently.
"This will be devastating for her. Victoria will be offered the opportunity to remain as a member of the royal family if she can accept the new direction we're taking. She will retain her title and her residence, but she will no longer have influence over policy decisions or public appearances. If she cannot accept these terms, she will be free to retire to her family's estate with a generous pension and our gratitude for her years of service." As father and son stood together looking out at the gathered citizens, both understood that they were witnessing a historic moment. The choice to support Catherine over Victoria was more than a family decision. It was a declaration about what the monarchy would represent for future generations. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the palace grounds. Tomorrow would bring challenges, difficult conversations, and significant changes. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, King Alexander felt at peace with his decision. He had chosen to support the person who embodied the values he wanted his kingdom to represent: compassion, service, and genuine connection with the people. The portrait gallery would be transformed. just as the monarchy itself was being transformed. Catherine's image would take its place of honor not because she had married into the royal family, but because she had proven herself worthy of representing its highest ideals. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Windermere Palace, but inside the royal residence, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lady Victoria Ashworth sat in her private chambers, still in her silk nightgown, staring at the formal letter that had been delivered to her door at precisely 8 o'clock. The palace stationery felt heavy in her hands as she read the words that effectively ended her 15-year reign as the kingdom's most influential royal woman. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret Thornbury, stood nervously near the window, occasionally glancing at her mistress with worried eyes. Margaret had served Victoria since before her marriage to King Alexander, and she had never seen her employer so completely still, so utterly silent. The woman who was known for her quick wit and sharp tongue seemed frozen in place. "My lady," Margaret ventured carefully, "perhaps we should call for some tea? You haven't eaten anything since yesterday evening." Victoria finally looked up from the letter, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Tea? Margaret, did you read this?" She held up the letter with a trembling hand. "The king has ordered that all of my official portraits be removed from the staterooms and replaced with paintings of that newcomer." The words came out as barely controlled whispers, but Margaret could hear the pain beneath the anger. Victoria had spent years carefully crafting her image as the perfect royal consort, studying protocols, mastering diplomatic languages, and building relationships with important political figures both within the kingdom and internationally. The thought of being erased from the official royal narrative was more than a political defeat. It was a personal devastation. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, in the palace's main portrait gallery, a team of carefully selected workers was already beginning the delicate process of removing Victoria's paintings. The head curator, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, supervised every movement with the precision of a surgeon. She had been given specific instructions from the king's private secretary about which portraits to remove and where they should be stored. "Careful with the frame on the coronation portrait," Dr. Hartwell instructed as 2 workers lifted the large painting from its prominent position. "That frame is 300 years old and has held portraits of 7 different queens." As Victoria's image was carried away, palace staff members gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. The older employees, many of whom had served during Victoria's early years as queen, watched with expressions of concern and confusion. They remembered when she had first arrived at the palace as a young bride, eager to learn and determined to honor her new role. Sarah Wellington, the head of housekeeping who had worked at the palace for 37 years, felt tears in her eyes as she watched Victoria's wedding portrait being wrapped in protective cloth. "She wasn't always like this," Sarah murmured to her assistant. "When she first came here, she used to ask about our families, remember our children's names. Something changed over the years." The transformation that Sarah remembered had been gradual, but noticeable. As Victoria had grown more secure in her position, she had also grown more distant from the staff and more focused on the political aspects of royal life. The warmth and curiosity she had shown as a young bride had been replaced by a calculated coolness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. In another wing of the palace, Princess Catherine was completely unaware of the morning's activities. She sat in the palace's private medical clinic, holding Prince Edward's hand as they waited for the results of her latest pregnancy checkup. At 3 months pregnant, she was still adjusting to the idea of bringing a child into the complex world of royal life. Patricia Coleman, the royal family's longtime physician, emerged from her office with a warm smile. "Everything looks perfect, Your Highness. The baby is developing normally, and all your tests show excellent results." Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. The stress of the past few weeks had left her worried about the potential effects on her pregnancy. Between the public controversy, the family tensions, and the uncertainty about her future role, she had been experiencing more anxiety than she cared to admit. "Dr. Coleman," Edward asked, "should Catherine be limiting her public appearances during this period?" Given everything that's been happening, the doctor considered the question thoughtfully. Physical stress isn't the primary concern at this stage, but emotional stress can certainly impact both mother and baby. "I would recommend that Princess Catherine continue with activities that bring her joy and fulfillment, while perhaps scaling back on anything that feels overwhelming or contentious." Catherine squeezed Edward's hand. "I don't want to use the pregnancy as an excuse to avoid difficult situations. The charitable work I've been doing is actually one of the things that gives me the most energy and purpose." As they left the medical clinic, Edward's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his father's secretary. "Catherine, I need to go speak with Father immediately. He says it's about the decision he's been considering." Catherine nodded, though she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "Whatever he's decided, we'll face it together. I meant what I said at that family dinner. I won't compromise our values or our children's future, no matter what it costs us." Edward kissed her gently before hurrying toward the king's private study. Catherine decided to take a walk through the palace gardens, needing fresh air and time to think. As she stepped outside, she was surprised to see James Morrison, the king's secretary, approaching with what appeared to be urgent news. "Your Highness," James said with a respectful bow, "His Majesty has asked me to inform you that he would like to meet with you in the Blue Room at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He has made some important decisions that will affect your future role in the royal family." Catherine felt her heart rate increase, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Should I be prepared for any particular type of discussion? I believe you will find His Majesty's decisions quite favorable to your vision for the monarchy's future, Your Highness." As James walked away, Catherine felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had prepared herself for the possibility that the king might ask her and Edward to step back from royal duties to preserve family harmony. The idea that his decision might actually support her approach had never seemed like a realistic possibility. Back in her chambers, Victoria was finally getting dressed for the day, choosing her most formal and imposing outfit, as if preparing for battle. She had decided to request an immediate audience with the king, hoping to convince him that his decision was a mistake that would damage the monarchy's reputation. "Margaret," Victoria said as her lady-in-waiting helped her with her jewelry, "call down to the king's office and request an appointment for this morning. I will not allow my 15 years of service to be dismissed without at least having the opportunity to defend my record." Margaret hesitated before responding. "My lady, I've already tried. Mr. Morrison said that His Majesty's schedule is completely full today and that he will not be taking any unscheduled meetings with family members." Victoria's reflection in the mirror showed a woman struggling to maintain her composure. The reality that she had been effectively shut out of the decision-making process was almost more humiliating than the decision itself. For years, she had been accustomed to having direct access to the king, to being consulted on important matters, to being treated as a true partner in the business of governing. "Then I will go to the Prime Minister," Victoria declared. "Lord Blackwood has always respected my judgment on matters of royal protocol. He will understand the danger of allowing sentimentality to override centuries of tradition." Margaret looked uncomfortable but felt obligated to share what she had learned from other palace staff. "My lady, I'm afraid that Lord Blackwood has already issued a statement expressing his full support for whatever decision His Majesty chooses to make regarding royal family arrangements." The political reality was becoming clear to Victoria, though she was reluctant to accept it. The king's decision had not been made in isolation. It had been carefully coordinated with key political leaders who had their own reasons for supporting a more popular and accessible royal family. Catherine's approval ratings were not just numbers on a poll. They represented genuine political capital that could benefit the entire government. Meanwhile, in a different part of the palace, the staff members who had supported Catherine throughout the controversy were beginning to hear whispers about the morning's events. Maria Santos, one of Catherine's personal assistants, had been told by a friend in the housekeeping department that significant changes were being made to the portrait gallery. "Is it true?" Maria asked her colleague, Jennifer Walsh. "Are they really replacing Lady Victoria's portraits with more pictures of Princess Catherine?" Jennifer, who had helped coordinate many of Catherine's charity visits, nodded with excitement. "It looks that way. And I heard from someone in the king's office that there's going to be a major announcement this afternoon about new directions for royal charitable work." The mood among Catherine's supporters was cautiously optimistic, but they were also aware that such dramatic changes could create lasting divisions within the palace community. Many of them had respect for Victoria's contributions over the years, even if they disagreed with her recent approach to royal duties. As the morning progressed, news of the portrait changes began to spread beyond the palace walls. Palace reporters who maintained contacts among the staff started receiving tips about unusual activity in the staterooms. By noon, several news outlets were reporting rumors about significant changes in royal family dynamics. The kingdom's most respected royal correspondent, Patricia Hammond, had covered the royal family for over 20 years. She understood the symbolic importance of portrait placement in royal protocol. When her sources confirmed that Victoria's official portraits were being removed and stored, she knew she was witnessing a historic shift in the monarchy's power structure. "This isn't just about family preferences," Patricia explained in an emergency broadcast. "The placement of official portraits in royal residences is a formal indication of status and influence within the monarchy. What we're seeing today represents the most significant change in royal hierarchy since King Alexander's marriage to Lady Victoria 15 years ago." Public reaction to the news was swift and largely positive. Social media platforms were flooded with messages of support for Princess Catherine and approval of the king's apparent decision to back her vision for a more engaged monarchy. Hashtags like Royal Evolution and Princess Catherine were trending within hours. However, not all reaction was positive. Conservative political commentators and traditionalist groups expressed concern about what they saw as the abandonment of proper royal protocols. Lord Geoffrey Pemberton, a longtime supporter of Victoria's approach to royal duties, issued a statement warning against the dangerous precedent of allowing popularity polls to determine royal policy. Back at the palace, Catherine spent the early afternoon in quiet reflection, preparing for her meeting with the king. She walked through the gardens where she had first met Edward during a diplomatic reception 3 years ago, remembering how overwhelmed she had felt by the grandeur and complexity of royal life. At that time, she had been working as a regional coordinator for rural development programs, a job that had given her extensive experience working with farming communities and small business owners. Her background had made her acutely aware of the challenges facing ordinary citizens, and she had never lost sight of those realities even as she adapted to royal life. The path through the garden led her to a small memorial statue dedicated to King Henry, Alexander's father, who had been beloved by the people for his down-to-earth approach to royal service. Catherine had often found inspiration in the stories about King Henry's willingness to break protocol when necessary to help those in need. As 2 o'clock approached, Catherine made her way to the Blue Room, one of the palace's most elegant reception areas. The room was traditionally used for important meetings with foreign dignitaries and significant announcements. The fact that the king had chosen this location for their meeting suggested that whatever he had decided would have formal, official significance. When Catherine entered the Blue Room, she found King Alexander standing near the fireplace, looking more relaxed and confident than she had seen him in weeks. Prince Edward was also there, his expression indicating that he had already been briefed on his father's decisions. "Catherine," the king said warmly, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace. "I want to begin by saying that the decision I've made was not easy, but it was necessary for the future of our monarchy and our kingdom." Catherine sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the king to explain what would happen to her family's future. "After considerable thought and consultation with trusted advisors, I have decided to fully support your vision for a more engaged, service-oriented royal family," Alexander continued. "Effective immediately, you will become the primary representative of royal charitable initiatives, and you will have my complete backing in developing programs that serve the needs of our people." The relief that Catherine felt was overwhelming, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Your Majesty, I am honored by your confidence in me. I promise that I will never take this responsibility lightly or use it for personal advancement." "I know you won't,"
the king replied.
"That's exactly why I've made this choice." The formal announcement of King Alexander's decision sent shockwaves through the kingdom's political establishment and beyond. Within hours of the official statement being released, the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from international media outlets, foreign dignitaries and citizens wanting to express their opinions about the unprecedented changes in royal family dynamics. Prime Minister Robert Blackwood convened an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the implications of the king's announcement. As he sat at the head of the long conference table in number 10 Downing Street, surrounded by his most senior ministers, he could see both excitement and concern on the faces around him. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Prime Minister began, We are witnessing what may be the most significant evolution in our constitutional monarchy since the establishment of our modern parliamentary system. The King's decision to openly support Princess Catherine's vision over Lady Victoria's traditional approach represents a fundamental shift in how the Crown will interact with both government and citizenry. Foreign Secretary Diana Maxwell leaned forward. Prime Minister, I've already received 3 calls from our ambassadors in European capitals. Other monarchies are watching our situation very carefully. Some are expressing admiration for the King's decisiveness, while others are concerned about the precedent this sets for royal families dealing with internal divisions. The reality was that constitutional monarchies around the world often struggled with balancing tradition and modernization. King Alexander's bold choice to publicly side with one family member over another was virtually unprecedented in modern royal history. Most similar situations had been handled through quiet resignations, extended vacations, or carefully worded statements that avoided taking clear positions. Minister of Social Affairs Patricia Hayes, who had worked closely with Catherine on several policy initiatives, spoke up with evident satisfaction. If I may say so, Prime Minister, this decision could not have come at a better time. Princess Catherine's charitable foundation proposals align perfectly with our government's agenda for rural development and social mobility. Having active royal support for these initiatives will significantly increase their chances of success. However, not everyone in the cabinet was entirely comfortable with the dramatic changes. Defense Secretary Lord William Crawford, a traditionalist who had served in government for over 20 years, expressed his concerns. While I understand the political benefits of this decision, we must also consider the potential risks. Lady Victoria has extensive connections with conservative political movements, both domestically and internationally. Her marginalization could create unexpected complications. The Prime Minister nodded thoughtfully. That's precisely why I want to meet with Princess Catherine as soon as possible. We need to ensure that this transition is handled with the utmost care and professionalism. The last thing our government needs is a scandal involving bitter disputes within the royal family. Meanwhile, back at Windermere Palace, Victoria was experiencing the full weight of her changed circumstances. She had spent the morning attempting to reach various political contacts, only to discover that most were suddenly unavailable, or were offering only polite but non-committal responses to her calls. The speed with which her influence had evaporated was both shocking and humiliating. Her private secretary, Marcus Webb, had been with her for 8 years and had never seen her so defeated. As he brought her the afternoon correspondence, he could see that she was struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. "My lady," Marcus said gently, "there are several letters here from charitable organizations that you have supported over the years. They are expressing their gratitude for your service and hoping that you will continue your involvement despite the changes in your official role." Victoria looked up from her desk, where she had been staring at architectural plans for the royal estate that would now never be implemented according to her vision. "Marcus, do you think I made mistakes? Do you think I became too focused on maintaining dignity and lost sight of other considerations?" The question surprised Marcus, as Victoria had never before shown any self-doubt about her approach to royal duties. He considered his response carefully, understanding that his words could either help her process this difficult transition or make it even more painful. "My lady, you have always conducted yourself with tremendous grace and intelligence. You brought stability to the monarchy during some very challenging political periods. Perhaps the kingdom has simply evolved to want something different from its royal family, but that doesn't diminish what you accomplished during your years of service." Victoria appreciated Marcus's diplomatic response, but she was beginning to understand that the changes occurring were about more than personal preferences or political calculations. The kingdom's relationship with its monarchy was fundamentally shifting, and she had failed to recognize or adapt to those changes quickly enough. Across the palace, Catherine was dealing with her own complex emotions about the day's events. While she was grateful for the king's support and excited about the opportunities it would create for her charitable work, she also felt genuine sadness about the pain this decision was causing Victoria. Edward found his wife sitting in their private study looking thoughtfully out the window toward the gardens where they had first met. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Grateful, excited, and guilty, all at the same time. Catherine admitted. I never wanted this to become a situation where someone had to be the winner and someone had to be the loser. I had hoped we could find a way for both approaches to coexist within the royal family. Edward took her hand. Catherine, you tried repeatedly to build bridges with Victoria. You invited her to participate in your charitable initiatives, you sought her advice on protocol matters, and you always showed respect for her experience. She chose to see you as a threat rather than as a partner. Catherine knew that Edward was right, but she still felt uncomfortable with how dramatically the situation had escalated. I keep thinking about that dinner conversation where everything finally erupted. Maybe I should have been more patient, found a gentler way to express my concerns. And maybe Victoria should have been more open to different perspectives, Edward replied. Catherine, you can't take responsibility for other people's choices. You remained true to your values throughout this entire process, and that's why Father ultimately decided to support you. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. James Morrison entered with a request from the king for both Catherine and Edward to join him for a meeting with Prime Minister Blackwood, who had requested an urgent consultation about the implementation of Catherine's charitable initiatives. As they made their way to the king's private office, Catherine realized that her new role would require her to work more closely with government officials and policymakers than she had initially anticipated. The charitable foundation she had envisioned was no longer just a royal family initiative. It was becoming a significant component of the kingdom's social policy agenda. The meeting with Prime Minister Blackwood proved to be both exhilarating and sobering. The Prime Minister's enthusiasm for Catherine's proposals was evident, but he also made clear the political realities she would need to navigate. Princess Catherine, Blackwood said, your foundation has the potential to serve as a model for public-private partnerships and social development. However, we must ensure that your initiatives are seen as genuinely independent rather than as extensions of government policy. The royal family's credibility depends on maintaining appropriate distance from partisan political positions. Catherine nodded, understanding the delicate balance she would need to maintain. Prime Minister, my goal has always been to address human needs rather than advance political agendas. I want to work with people across the political spectrum who share a commitment to helping families and communities thrive. King Alexander listened to the discussion with satisfaction, seeing that his decision to support Catherine was already yielding practical benefits for both the monarchy and the kingdom. However, he also understood that they were entering uncharted territory that would require careful navigation. Prime Minister, the king said, I want to be very clear that Princess Catherine's work should complement government initiatives without competing with them or creating any appearance of royal interference in political matters. We are committed to constitutional propriety, even as we embrace a more engaged approach to royal service. The meeting continued for over an hour, covering topics ranging from funding mechanisms for the charitable foundation to protocols for Catherine's interactions with local government officials during her community visits. By the end of the discussion, Catherine had a much clearer understanding of both the opportunities and the constraints that would shape her future work. As evening approached, palace staff began preparing for what would undoubtedly be an unusual dinner. For the first time since the crisis began, the entire royal family would be gathering in the same room, including Victoria. The king had insisted on a family dinner, stating that they needed to address the new arrangements openly, rather than allowing tensions to fester. Victoria spent considerable time preparing for the dinner, choosing her outfit and jewelry with the same care she had always applied to state occasions. She understood that this would likely be her last opportunity to address the family as a group about the changes that had been imposed. Catherine also approached the dinner with careful consideration, wanting to show respect for Victoria's years of service while not compromising her own principles or backing down from the positions that had led to the king's support. When the family gathered in the private dining room, the atmosphere was formal but not hostile. King Alexander had clearly given thought to the seating arrangement, placing himself at the head of the table with Edward and Catherine to his right, Victoria to his left, and Princess Margaret positioned where she could serve as a calming presence if tensions arose. The conversation during the early part of the meal was carefully neutral, focusing on palace renovations, upcoming diplomatic visits, and other topics that avoided the central conflict that had dominated recent weeks. However, everyone understood that the real discussion would come with dessert and coffee, when family business was traditionally addressed. As the staff cleared the main course, Victoria finally spoke directly to the situation they were all thinking about. "Alexander, I want you to know that while I disagree with the decision you've made, I respect your right as king to determine the direction of the monarchy. I also want Catherine to know that my opposition to some of her initiatives was never personal. I simply believed that different approaches would better serve the crown's long-term interests." Catherine looked directly at Victoria as she responded. "Lady Victoria, I have always had tremendous respect for your intelligence and your dedication to the royal family. I regret that we weren't able to find common ground, but I appreciate your commitment to the crown's welfare, even when we disagreed about methods." Edward felt proud of his wife's gracious response, but he also wanted to ensure that the family's new direction was clearly understood. "I think it's important that we all acknowledge that the changes Father has announced represent more than adjustments in individual roles. They represent a fundamental evolution in how our family will serve the kingdom." Princess Margaret, who had remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, finally added her perspective. "I think what we're seeing is the monarchy adapting to serve a new generation of citizens who have different expectations about royal service. That's not a criticism of anyone's past efforts. It's simply recognition that institutions must evolve to remain relevant." King Alexander was pleased with how maturely his family was handling the discussion. "I want all of you to understand that the decisions I've made were not intended to diminish anyone's contributions or create lasting divisions within our family. However, I also want to be clear that the changes we're implementing are not temporary experiments. They represent the monarchy's commitment to a new approach that I believe will strengthen our relationship with the people we serve." As the dinner concluded, family members began to disperse to their various evening activities. Victoria excused herself first, maintaining her dignity, but clearly eager to return to the privacy of her own chambers. Catherine and Edward stayed behind to discuss some practical matters with the king about the implementation of her new responsibilities. When Catherine and Edward finally retired to their own apartments, they found themselves reflecting on how completely their lives had changed in just a few weeks. The pregnancy that had seemed like such a challenge to manage amidst family conflicts now felt like a blessing that would bring new life into a royal family that was itself being reborn. "Do you think Victoria will be able to accept the changes?" Catherine asked as they prepared for bed. Edward considered the question. "I think she'll need time to adjust, but she's intelligent enough to understand that fighting against the king's decision would only damage her own position further. She may never fully embrace your approach, but I believe she'll find ways to contribute that don't create ongoing conflict." As Catherine fell asleep that night, she thought about the enormous responsibilities she was about to assume, and the child she was carrying who would grow up in a very different royal family than the one she had married into just 6 months earlier. 3 months had passed since King Alexander's momentous decision, and the transformation within Windermere Palace was remarkable to behold. The portrait gallery, now dominated by images of Princess Catherine at various charitable events and community gatherings, told a visual story of the monarchy's new direction. Visitors to the palace immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere from formal grandeur to purposeful engagement. Catherine stood in her newly established office, formerly a rarely used reception room, reviewing architectural plans for the first housing development that would be built on royal estate land. Her pregnancy was now clearly visible, and she had adapted her schedule to accommodate both her changing physical needs and her expanding responsibilities as the face of the monarchy's charitable initiatives. The success of Catherine's programs had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The Rural Families Foundation, officially launched 6 weeks after the king's announcement, had already received commitments for funding from private donors totaling over £50 million. More importantly, the foundation's practical impact was becoming evident in communities across the kingdom. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the foundation's newly appointed director and former head of rural development at the University of Cambridge, entered Catherine's office carrying a thick folder of progress reports. "Your Highness, I have some remarkable updates from our pilot programs in the northern provinces." Catherine looked up from her architectural plans with genuine excitement. "Please, tell me everything. I've been looking forward to hearing how the families are responding to the job training initiatives." Dr. Mitchell opened her folder and spread several charts across Catherine's desk. "The results are beyond what we hoped for. The agricultural technology training program has a 93% completion rate, and 87% of participants have already found employment or started their own businesses. Most significantly, the average family income in participating communities has increased by 38% in just 2 months. Catherine studied the charts with the same intensity she had once applied to policy briefings during her pre-royal career. Sarah, what feedback are we getting from the participants themselves? Are they feeling genuinely supported, or are there aspects of the program that feel condescending or inadequate? That's perhaps the most encouraging part, Dr. Mitchell replied. We've conducted extensive interviews with participants, and the overwhelming response is that they feel respected and empowered rather than patronized. Several people mentioned that having programs developed by someone who has actually worked in rural communities makes a significant difference in how relevant and practical the training feels. The success of Catherine's initiatives was being closely watched by government officials, international development experts, and other royal families around the world. The model of royals taking active hands-on roles in addressing social and economic challenges was inspiring similar approaches in other monarchies, while also drawing criticism from traditionalists who worried about the politicization of royal roles. Meanwhile, Lady Victoria had spent the past 3 months quietly but systematically rebuilding her role within the royal family structure. Rather than fighting against the changes that had been implemented, she had chosen to focus on areas where her expertise and connections could still make valuable contributions without competing directly with Catherine's initiatives. Victoria's private secretary, Marcus Webb, had helped her identify opportunities to support cultural preservation projects and international diplomatic initiatives that complemented rather than conflicted with the new royal priorities. She had also begun writing what would eventually become a comprehensive guide to royal protocol and ceremony, documenting traditions and practices that might otherwise be lost as the monarchy evolved. On this particular morning, Victoria was meeting with Lady Eleanor Pembroke, the director of the kingdom's National Museum, to discuss a proposal for preserving and exhibiting royal artifacts that told the story of the monarchy's evolution over centuries. Lady Victoria, Eleanor said as they walked through the museum's archives, your knowledge of royal ceremonial objects and their historical significance is irreplaceable. This exhibition could serve as an important bridge between the monarchy's traditional heritage and its modern direction. Victoria examined a collection of ceremonial swords that had been carried by kings during coronations dating back 400 years. Eleanor, I think the key to making this exhibition meaningful is showing how each generation of royals has adapted to serve their contemporary society while maintaining the essential dignity and purpose of the institution. The conversation represented a significant shift in Victoria's perspective. Rather than viewing change as a threat to royal traditions, she was beginning to see how documenting and preserving those traditions could actually support the monarchy's continued evolution. Back at the palace, Prince Edward was preparing for a series of international visits that would showcase the kingdom's new approach to royal diplomacy. Instead of focusing solely on ceremonial functions and trade negotiations, Edward would be highlighting the social development programs that Catherine had initiated, demonstrating how royal leadership could address global challenges. Edward's first stop would be the Nordic kingdom of Norlandia, where Queen Astrid had expressed particular interest in learning about the rural family's foundations approach to combining traditional craftsmanship training with modern technology skills. The visit represented an opportunity to share successful practices while building stronger diplomatic relationships based on shared values rather than just shared interests. As Edward reviewed briefing materials for his trip, he reflected on how much his own role had expanded since his father's decision to support Catherine's vision. He was no longer just the crown prince waiting to inherit the throne. He was becoming an active partner in implementing a new model of royal service that could influence monarchies around the world. The international dimension of the changes at Windermere Palace was becoming increasingly significant. Constitutional scholars from several universities had begun studying what they called the Windermere model as a potential template for how traditional monarchies could remain relevant and valuable in modern democratic societies. Professor David Hartwell of Oxford University, who had written extensively about constitutional monarchy, published an article that attracted international attention. What we are witnessing in the kingdom is not the abandonment of royal traditions, but rather their evolution into forms that can effectively serve contemporary social needs. Princess Catherine's approach demonstrates that royal service can be both dignified and directly helpful to citizens' daily lives. However, not all international reaction was positive. Conservative political commentators in several countries criticized King Alexander's decision as a dangerous precedent that could undermine the stability of constitutional monarchies by making them too dependent on popular approval rather than constitutional authority. Lord Geoffrey Pemberton, who had initially opposed the changes, published a response defending the traditional approach. While I understand the appeal of popularity-driven royal service, we must remember that the Crown's greatest strength has always been its ability to remain above the political fray. When royals become too closely identified with particular social policies, they risk losing the neutral authority that makes them effective constitutional figures. The debate was playing out not just in academic journals, but also in the kingdom's daily life. Opinion polls showed that Catherine's approval ratings had stabilized at around 85%, while support for the monarchy as an institution had actually increased since the king's decision. However, there remained a significant minority of citizens who worried about the long-term implications of the changes. Catherine was acutely aware of these concerns and had worked carefully to ensure that her programs maintained broad political support rather than becoming identified with particular partisan positions. During a recent meeting with parliamentary leaders from both major political parties, she had emphasized her commitment to working with anyone who shared her goals of strengthening families and communities. "I want to be very clear," Catherine had told the parliamentary group, "that our foundation's work is designed to complement governmental efforts rather than replace them or compete with them. We are not trying to implement political policies. We are trying to address human needs in ways that bring people together rather than divide them." The political balancing act was delicate, but seemed to be working. Conservative MPs appreciated that Catherine's programs emphasized personal responsibility and community self-reliance rather than government dependency, while progressive MPs supported the focus on economic opportunity and social mobility for disadvantaged families. As Catherine's pregnancy progressed, palace physicians recommended that she reduce her travel schedule, leading to an innovative solution that would further demonstrate the monarchy's adaptation to modern technology. The foundation began hosting virtual meetings and online conferences that allowed Catherine to maintain her connection with program participants and community leaders without the physical demands of constant travel. The virtual engagement proved surprisingly effective and popular. Citizens appreciated being able to interact with Catherine from their own communities, and the online format allowed for more extended and substantive conversations than were typically possible during traditional royal visits. During one particularly memorable virtual conference, Catherine spoke with Maria Santos, a single mother from a rural farming community who had completed the foundation's agricultural technology training program and had started her own greenhouse business. "Your Highness," Maria said during the video call, "I want you to know that this program didn't just give me job skills. It gave me hope that I could build a better future for my children. When I see you on these calls, working even while you're expecting your own baby, it reminds me that we all have the ability to keep growing and contributing no matter what challenges we face." Catherine felt tears in her eyes as she responded to Maria's words. "Maria, thank you for sharing that with me. Hearing about your success and your determination is exactly why this work matters so much to me. You and the other families we're working with are the real heroes in this story." The personal connections that Catherine was building with citizens through her work were creating a new model for royal citizen relationships that combined the dignity of the monarchy with genuine human connection and mutual respect. Meanwhile, King Alexander was dealing with the international implications of his decision through diplomatic channels. He had received private communications from several other monarchs, expressing both admiration and concern about the precedent his choice had set. King Frederick of Denmark had written, "Alexander, while I admire the courage of your decision and the positive results it has generated, I must admit that it has created some challenging discussions within my own family about how we should approach our royal duties." Queen Sofia of Spain had been more direct. "The success of Princess Catherine's programs is impressive, but I worry about the long-term sustainability of royal popularity that depends on specific policy achievements rather than constitutional stability." Alexander understood these concerns but remained convinced that his choice had been necessary for the monarchy's survival and relevance. During a private dinner with several trusted advisors, he articulated his reasoning. The choice we faced was not between tradition and innovation, but between a monarchy that serves its people and a monarchy that simply exists alongside its people. I chose service, and I believe history will vindicate that choice. As winter approached and Catherine entered the final months of her pregnancy, the kingdom began preparing for the birth of the heir who would grow up in a fundamentally transformed royal family. Palace staff had already begun discussing how the child's upbringing would reflect the new royal values while maintaining appropriate security and protocol. Catherine and Edward had made it clear that they wanted their child to understand both the privileges and responsibilities of royal life from an early age. They planned to include the child in age-appropriate charitable activities and to ensure that he or she understood that royal status was earned through service rather than simply inherited through blood. The evening news carried a report about the latest polling data showing continued strong support for the monarchy and particular enthusiasm for Catherine's approach to royal service. However, the report also noted that Victoria had begun to rebuild her public profile through her cultural preservation work, suggesting that the royal family was finding ways to incorporate different approaches rather than simply replacing one with another. As Catherine prepared for bed that night, feeling her baby moving actively inside her, she reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in her life and in the kingdom over the past few months. The decision that King Alexander had made had not just changed individual roles within the royal family. It had redefined what the monarchy could be in a modern democratic society. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Catherine felt confident that the foundation they had built would continue to serve the kingdom's people long after the current generation of royals had passed from the scene. 6 months later, as spring flowers bloomed in the palace gardens, Princess Catherine stood on the balcony of the palace's nursery, holding her 3-month-old son, Prince William Alexander Edward. The baby, already showing signs of his father's dark hair and his mother's warm brown eyes, had become a symbol of the new generation that would inherit the transformed monarchy. The birth had been celebrated throughout the kingdom with a joy and enthusiasm that surprised even seasoned royal observers. Unlike previous royal births that had been marked by formal ceremonies and distant celebrations, William's arrival had been commemorated by thousands of small community-based gatherings organized through Catherine's foundation network. Citizens who had participated in the Rural Families Foundation programs had hosted local celebrations, creating a sense of personal connection to the new royal heir that was unprecedented in the kingdom's history. Catherine adjusted the baby's blanket as she looked out over the palace grounds, where construction was well underway on the first affordable housing development built on royal estate land. The sight of families moving into their new homes had become one of her greatest sources of satisfaction, knowing that her son would grow up seeing the monarchy's resources used directly to improve people's lives. "He's going to have quite a legacy to live up to," said a familiar voice behind her. Catherine turned to see Lady Victoria approaching, carrying a beautifully wrapped gift and wearing an expression that was warmer than any Catherine had seen from her in months. "Lady Victoria," Catherine said with genuine pleasure, "I'm so glad you came to visit." Victoria had indeed found her place in the new royal structure, and the past few months had seen a remarkable transformation in her relationship with Catherine. The cultural preservation project that Victoria had initiated had become a significant success, creating a bridge between the monarchy's historical traditions and its modern mission. More importantly, her work had given her a sense of purpose and achievement that didn't compete with Catherine's initiatives. "I brought something special for Prince William," Victoria said, offering the wrapped package. "It's a christening gown that was worn by 7 previous royal heirs, including his father and grandfather. I thought it might be meaningful for him to be connected to that history, even as he grows up in such different circumstances." Catherine accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding the significance of Victoria's gesture. "This is incredibly generous and thoughtful. I know how important these traditions are, and I want William to understand and appreciate his heritage even as he learns to serve in new ways." Victoria moved to stand beside Catherine on the balcony, looking down at the housing construction. "You know, Catherine, I've been watching what you've accomplished these past months, and I have to admit that I was wrong about some things. I thought that maintaining traditional royal distance was the best way to preserve the monarchy's authority and dignity. but what you've shown is that genuine connection with the people actually strengthens rather than diminishes royal influence. The conversation represented a remarkable evolution in Victoria's perspective. Her cultural preservation work had brought her into contact with historians and ordinary citizens who had helped her understand that royal traditions had always been about service and leadership, not just ceremony and privilege. The external forms of monarchy had changed throughout history, but the essential purpose of providing moral leadership and practical support to the kingdom had remained constant. "Victoria," Catherine said gently, "I've learned so much from watching how you handle diplomatic functions and ceremonial duties. There are aspects of royal service that require the kind of formal expertise and cultural knowledge that you possess. I hope we can continue finding ways to work together, rather than seeing our different approaches as incompatible." Prince Edward appeared in the nursery doorway, having just returned from a successful diplomatic mission to 3 African kingdoms where he had signed agreements for educational and development partnerships modeled on Catherine's domestic programs. His international work was extending the influence of the Windermere model beyond the kingdom's borders, creating opportunities for the monarchy to play a leadership role in global social development efforts. "How did the meetings go?" Catherine asked as Edward joined them on the balcony and gently took his son into his arms. "Better than I hoped," Edward replied. President Mbeki of the Zambari Republic was particularly interested in adapting our rural development approach for communities affected by climate change. "We're going to pilot a program that combines traditional agricultural knowledge with modern sustainable technology, using local leaders trained through our foundation's methods." The international expansion of Catherine's approach was creating new diplomatic opportunities for the kingdom, while also demonstrating the practical value of royal engagement in addressing global challenges. Foreign policy experts were beginning to recognize that the monarchy's credibility in promoting social development could serve as a powerful tool for building international relationships based on shared values rather than just strategic interests. King Alexander joined the family group on the balcony, moving more slowly than he had a year ago, but with an expression of deep satisfaction as he looked at his grandson and the construction project visible below. At 73, the king was beginning to think about succession planning, though he had no immediate plans to abdicate. "Father," Edward said, "the Prime Minister has asked for a meeting next week to discuss the possibility of hosting an international conference on royal leadership in social development. Apparently, representatives from 8 different monarchies have expressed interest in learning more about our model." Alexander nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of leadership role I hoped we could play when I made the decision to support Catherine's vision. We're not just transforming our own monarchy. We're showing other royal families how they can remain relevant and valuable in the modern world." The idea of hosting an international conference represented both an opportunity and a challenge. It would position the kingdom as a leader in monarchical innovation, but it would also require careful management to avoid appearing to criticize other royal families' traditional approaches. Catherine shifted Prince William to her other arm as she considered the implications. "If we do host such a conference, I think it's important that we present our approach as one option among many, rather than as the only correct way to handle royal duties. Different kingdoms have different histories, constitutions, and social needs." Victoria, who had extensive experience with international royal protocols, offered her perspective. "Catherine is absolutely right. We need to frame this as sharing experiences and ideas, rather than promoting a particular ideology. I could help coordinate the ceremonial aspects while Catherine focuses on the substantive program content." The collaborative spirit that had developed between Catherine and Victoria was one of the most unexpected and positive outcomes of the previous year's dramatic changes. Rather than creating permanent divisions within the royal family, the crisis had ultimately led to a more effective distribution of roles and responsibilities that utilized each person's strengths. As the family group talked, palace staff began arriving with the afternoon's correspondence and briefing materials. Catherine's schedule had become even more demanding than it had been before William's birth, as the success of her programs had led to requests for expansion and replication from communities across the kingdom. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the foundation director, approached with a folder containing the latest impact assessments. "Your Highness, I have some remarkable statistics from our 6-month evaluation." The communities participating in our programs have seen a 47% reduction in youth unemployment, a 32% increase in new business formations, and a 28% improvement in school completion rates. Catherine reviewed the numbers with the same careful attention she had always given to data analysis. Sarah, these results are better than our most optimistic projections. Are we confident that these improvements are sustainable, or might they be temporary effects that will fade over time? The sustainability indicators are very encouraging, Dr. Mitchell replied. The businesses and community organizations that people have created through our programs are continuing to grow and generate ongoing employment. More importantly, we're seeing evidence that the communities are developing internal leadership capacity that reduces their dependence on external support. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison with an urgent message from Prime Minister Blackwood. Your Highness, the Prime Minister has requested an emergency consultation about a developing situation in the northern provinces. Apparently, there's been significant flooding in areas where our housing development projects are. Catherine felt a surge of anxiety as she thought about the families who had recently moved into the new communities that had been built on royal estate land. James, do we have any information about casualties or damage to the housing developments? The preliminary reports are actually quite positive, Morrison replied. The sustainable building techniques and flood management systems that were incorporated into the housing designs appear to have protected the communities much better than surrounding areas with older construction. The news provided an unexpected validation of the comprehensive approach that Catherine had insisted on for the Foundation's building projects. Rather than simply providing basic housing, the developments had incorporated environmental sustainability and disaster resilience features that were now proving their value under real-world conditions. Edward handed Prince William back to Catherine and began preparing to leave for the affected areas. I should go to the northern provinces immediately to assess the situation and coordinate relief efforts. This is exactly the kind of challenge where royal presence can make a practical difference. I want to come with you, Catherine said, though she knew that traveling with a 3-month-old baby would create logistical complications. Victoria spoke up unexpectedly. Catherine, what if I accompany Edward to represent the royal family in the flood areas? I have experience with disaster relief coordination from my work with international aid organizations. You could maintain communication and coordination from here while taking care of William. The offer surprised everyone, as Victoria had not been directly involved in the Foundation's operational activities. However, her suggestion made practical sense and would demonstrate the royal family's unified response to the emergency. King Alexander endorsed the proposal. I think that's an excellent idea. Victoria's experience with logistics and protocol would be valuable in coordinating with local officials and aid organizations. Catherine can provide strategic guidance while Victoria handles the on-site representation. The flood response became a defining moment for the new royal family structure. Over the following week, Edward and Victoria worked together in the affected areas, with Edward focusing on direct community support and Victoria coordinating with government agencies and international relief organizations. Catherine maintained constant communication from the palace, using her Foundation network to mobilize resources and volunteers. The media coverage of the flood response highlighted how effectively the royal family's different approaches could complement each other during crisis situations. Victoria's formal diplomatic skills proved invaluable in securing rapid government approvals for emergency aid, while Edward's hands-on approach reassured affected families that their needs were being prioritized. Catherine's coordination efforts ensured that relief resources reached communities efficiently and effectively. Most significantly, the housing developments built through the Foundation's programs became temporary shelter centers for displaced families from surrounding areas, demonstrating the practical value of the royal investment in sustainable community infrastructure. By the time the floodwaters receded, public support for the transformed monarchy had reached new heights. The crisis had shown citizens that their royal family could respond effectively to real emergencies while maintaining the dignity and leadership that had always been expected from the crown. As Catherine sat in the nursery that evening, feeding Prince William and reading reports about the successful flood response, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that first controversial visit to help the farmer with his overturned cart. What had begun as a simple impulse to help someone in need had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how the monarchy served its people. The baby in her arms represented the future of this transformed royal family, a child who would grow up understanding that royal privilege came with genuine responsibility for the welfare of others. William would learn the ceremonies and protocols that Victoria valued, but he would also learn the direct service and community engagement that Catherine had pioneered. Outside the nursery window, the lights of the new housing development twinkled in the distance, home to dozens of families who had found stability and opportunity through the programs that had emerged from one king's decision to choose compassion over tradition. The portrait gallery downstairs displayed images that told the story of this transformation, but the real measure of its success was visible in the lives that had been changed and the communities that had been strengthened. Prince Edward found Catherine in the nursery and settled into the chair beside her. The Prime Minister called with the final assessment of the flood response. The loss of life was minimal, property damage was significantly less than initially feared, and the affected communities are already beginning recovery efforts. Most importantly, the sustainable building techniques we used have been officially adopted as the new standard for all government housing projects. Catherine smiled as she looked down at their sleeping son. William is going to inherit a kingdom where the monarchy doesn't just represent tradition and ceremony, but active leadership in solving real problems and serving real needs. Just like his mother taught us, Edward replied, gently stroking the baby's head. As the evening settled into night, the royal family had truly found its new identity, one that honored the past while embracing a future of meaningful service and genuine connection with the people they were privileged to serve.